Let's get into it. This is TeenSpace. Hello and welcome to the TeenSpace Podcast. My name is Danielle, your host, and for today's episode, I've got another interesting journal article to share with you all. Now, since we are nearing the end of January, I'd like to extend a congratulations from the entire TeenSpace team on a successful first month of 2026. We at TeenSpace had a wonderful start of the year with the beginning of our Michigan TeenSpace chapter, our popcorn fundraiser in mid-January, where we were able to partner with Double Good and allocate 50% of our total profits to our initiative, and the official 501c3 certification of our organization. Anyway, the end of January also means something else is soon approaching. Valentine's Day. For some teens, that means the preparation of cards, gifts, and even first-time flowers. But for others, this holiday may bring first-time confessions and first-time rejections. Now, rejection doesn't always have to be romantic either. In general, teens face rejection through being left out, not quote-unquote chosen, or just being in a space where they feel like they don't belong. Everyone's had their moments where they felt alone, even in a large group. So today, instead of talking about St. Valentine or Cupid, this episode will go over what rejection actually does to the teenage brain and why it can feel so intense, especially at this stage of life. Alright, to understand rejection beyond just feelings, I want to ground this episode in real research. So as I said, I have a really interesting article from the National Institute of Health that looks specifically at how adolescents' brains respond to social rejection. This is important because a lot of earlier research on social pain focuses specifically on adults, but adolescence is a completely different developmental stage. In this study, researchers used brain imaging to observe what happens when teenagers experience social exclusion in real time. Instead of just asking teens to describe how rejection feels, scientists actually looked at which parts of the brain were activated during these moments. The participants in the study were adolescents, roughly middle school to high school age, and they completed a task designed to simulate a common experience: being left out. While this was happening, their brain activity was measured using a functional MRI or fMRI, which allows researchers to see changes in blood flow associated with neural activity. What makes this study especially relevant is that it doesn't treat rejection as something abstract or overly emotional. It treats it as a measurable neurological experience, as it is. The researchers were able to identify specific brain regions that consistently activated when teens were excluded, regions that are also involved in processing pain, stress, and emotional distress in general. This NIH research helps to answer a question that a lot of teens ask themselves after being rejected. Why does this hurt so much? The goal of today's episode isn't to pathologize normal emotions or turn everyday experiences into diagnoses. Instead, it's to use neuroscience to explain why rejection feels so intense during adolescence and how understanding your brain can actually help you respond to those experiences with more clarity and self-compassion. Alright, let's get straight into it. So, to understand why rejection can feel so overwhelming during the teenage years, we have to talk briefly about the adolescent brain. Adolescence is a period of rapid brain development, which is something that we've definitely talked about on this podcast, but not all parts of the brain develop at the same pace. The regions involved in emotional and social connection mature earlier, while the areas responsible for emotional regulation and perspective taking are still developing. At the same time, social belonging becomes especially important. Peer relationships start to carry more emotional weight, and feedback from others, whether it is acceptance or rejection, still can feel magnified. From a strictly biological perspective, this makes sense, since humans are social beings, and for most of our evolutionary history, being a part of a group was tied to survival. So when the brain detects exclusion, it reacts really strongly, particularly during adolescence, when social connection plays a central role in identity formation. Furthermore, because social connection plays such a central role in identity formation during adolescence, moments of exclusion don't just feel disappointing, they can feel personal. I'm sure a lot of us can think of moments where at first we thought that something was the end of the world, and then realized it really wasn't that deep, because I think we tend to think a lot more about what people perceive of us rather than realizing that they probably have their own issues as well. But that's a whole other topic. Anyway, back to my prior train of thought. This is one of the reasons why researchers became interested in studying rejection specifically in teenagers, rather than just assuming adolescent experiences mirror those of adults. Adolescence isn't really adulthood, it's a smaller version. It's its own unique neurological and social phase. This is the exact reason why Nisha and the rest of the TeenSpace team work so hard at TeenSpace to advocate and really make sure that our target audience is teens, because there's something so special about your teenage years that can't really be replicated at other stages of your life. Okay, back to the study. Participants believed that they were playing a simple virtual ball-tossing game with peers their age. At first, this game was inclusive, where everyone received the ball equally. But then, after no explanation, the other players stopped including the participant. This task, called cyberball, has been widely used in social neuroscience because it reliably triggers feelings of exclusion without causing lasting harm. While this was happening, participants' brain activity was measured using the fMRI, allowing researchers to observe neural responses as the rejection occurred. Now, when adolescents experienced exclusion, researchers found increased activity in a region of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC. This area is involved in processing emotional distress, but it's also active during experiences of physical pain. That overlap is significant, since it suggests that the brain does not sharply distinguish between social pain and physical pain. In neurological terms, rejection is processed as something threatening. At the same time, areas involved in emotional regulation, particularly the prefrontal cortex, were also engaged. However, because these regions are still developing during adolescence, with the prefrontal cortex being fully developed at around 25, many did not immediately regulate the emotional response, and this can explain why rejection feels sudden, intense, and difficult to move past, especially in the moment. I feel like this really aligns with experiences that I've had, since I think that when you're in the moment and you're experiencing these feelings of rejection, whether it be subconsciously or consciously, suddenly it becomes really hard to think of what to do next. You're just frozen there, staring at the people around you and seeing that they're having fun, maybe without you, and then you're just sitting there, right? In my opinion, one of the most important implications of this research is validation. If rejection feels deeply painful, that reaction isn't irrational or immature. It actually just reflects how the adolescent brain processes social information. To me, I guess this helps explain why being excluded can linger emotionally and how minor social interactions can really feel significant. It also, I guess, gives teens a reason as to why it's common to replay moments of rejection repeatedly. In my experience, maybe this isn't just with moments of rejection, but just embarrassing moments in general, I find myself replaying them over and over and thinking about, ooh, why did I do that? Or, ooh, why did I say that? And I think that that ties back to what I was kind of going on a tangent on earlier about, and how sometimes you're really thinking and overthinking things that no one else really paid attention to. For rejection specifically, where it seems like nobody is paying attention in general, I guess this research also helps solidify the fact that, again, as I said earlier, there are real reasons why you're feeling these emotions, and it's simply due to the way your brain processes its stimuli. Your brain is responding to a perceived social threat, even if that threat doesn't define someone's worth or future. And I guess understanding neuroscience, and especially the neuroscience of rejection, doesn't eliminate the pain. However, I think that it can change how teens respond to it. Let's move on to our next section of using neuroscience to navigate rejection. Alright, by first recognizing rejection as a biological stress response, you can reduce your self-criticism. Instead of asking, what is wrong with me, the question becomes, what is my brain reacting to? I think connection also matters, since supportive relationships, even just one trusted person in the room, can help calm the neural systems involved in social pain. I think time also plays a role as well, since emotional responses activate quickly while the regulation part takes longer. By allowing space for emotions without rushing resolution, you'll be supporting recovery. Finally, another takeaway is that it's important to separate self-worth from social outcomes. Pain is a signal, not necessarily judgment. I think that by understanding your own self-worth and understanding that you act according to your values, it doesn't really matter what other people's categories of criticism are. Whether or not they include you in something does not reflect the fact that they personally think that you're a bad person, or personally think that they don't want your help or inclusion in this topic or subject matter or situation. But if that is even the case, their judgment of you doesn't really mean anything to you unless you make it mean something to you. By understanding that your feelings of deep remorse or feelings of not feeling good enough are biological responses, first, you're allowed to feel these emotions, really understand why you're going through it. Then realize, okay, now that I know why my body is reacting in this way, you can move on, as I said, to understanding that, hey, maybe I shouldn't put that much stress into it or put that much weight into what other people think of me. And I think that's a really well-rounded way to get past those feelings of rejection and then find the people who actually make you feel supported. Hopefully that makes sense. Anyway, this NIH research reminds us that rejection is not simply an emotional experience, it's a neurological one. For adolescents, social exclusion activates brain regions associated with pain and distress, which explains why these moments feel so intense, again, as I said earlier. But understanding the science behind rejection gives you agency. I think that's a really good way to explain what I just said. It allows teens to respond with greater compassion towards themselves and to recognize that painful reactions are part of being human, not necessarily signs of weakness. And just to reiterate, obviously I had the cheesy reason of wanting to talk about rejection because Valentine's Day is slowly coming, but I really wanted to bring this study and this research to the podcast specifically because I think that, again, it's so important to weigh both the biological or just logical in general facts with what you're feeling emotionally. I think the best way to separate yourself from an anxiety attack or ground yourself when you're feeling overwhelmed or under a lot of pressure is by looking at what's concrete. You can see this in the way that when you are going through an anxiety attack or panic attack or something like that, you always look to ground yourself in, okay, what can I see, what can I hear, what can I taste, what can I feel, and what can I touch, through the various methods of coping strategies. However, these apply to situations of rejection as well. If you're in one of these moments, you should look at, okay, why is my body feeling this way? I feel like I've said that a bunch of times, but just this research is so interesting to me, and I hope it's interesting to you as well, and hopefully gives you a bit more insight on how you can deal with some distressing scenarios in the future. Alright, so before I end this episode, I just want to talk for a quick second, not as someone explaining the study, but just as like a person. If you take nothing else away from this, I want you to remember that rejection obviously hurts for a reason. It's not because you're weak, it's not because you can't handle things, it's because your brain is literally wired to care about connection. There was a reason, a prehistoric reason why our bodies were built to see rejection, spot it, and then flag, sound the alarms, etc. The science just gives us proof that something that teens already know intuitively is important. And honestly, again, this is really relieving. Once you know that this rejection activates that same pain system as physical pain, it becomes a lot harder to tell yourself, I shouldn't be feeling this way. Again, you're allowed to feel it, and your brain is just doing what it does. And hopefully I'm not being too repetitive, but I know I kind of touched on something earlier, but I want to kind of elaborate on it. Sometimes, actually most of the time, your brain isn't always telling the full story. Since rejection has a way of making everything feel very final, very concrete, like one moment says something really huge about who you are, or like what you're doing, or where you belong, neurologically that is not what's happening at all. It's a reaction, not necessarily a conclusion. And this is something I feel like I've seen again and again. People who feel rejected that aren't actually unworthy. They're just in a moment where their brain is louder than their perspective. And again, what helps is pretending that rejection doesn't hurt. Feel those emotions. Kind of sit in it for a while, but don't ruminate. You have to realize that that pain won't be permanent and there won't always be people excluding you in this way. Sometimes all you can do is just give it time and talk it out. Find someone you're comfortable with, someone you can trust, someone you can reach out to. Again, your voice matters. That's like the big TeenSpace motto. There will always be someone out there who will listen to you and understand you, empathize with you. I can empathize with you if you've felt these moments. Sometimes you just need to get one person to remind you that you are still you, even if one situation doesn't work out. You act according to your values and be the best person you can be with each step, each decision, each action you make. And so, as we're heading towards Valentine's Day, which I wanted to mention again since we're going full circle here, rejection will feel personal, but it's not a measurement of your worth. It's a moment, and moments pass. So, if you're dealing with rejection right now, I hope that this episode helps you be a little gentler with yourself, and maybe even a little gentler with other people as well, because everyone's brain is doing its own version of this whole behind the scenes. Alright, final note, actually the final note, I wanted to connect this entire conversation to things that I've been seeing online. There's this idea of rejection therapy, where you go and try and get yourself rejected as many times as possible so that you feel ready for your next acceptance. I don't know if I represented that accurately, but to my understanding, these people are just going for every single opportunity that they can, and in the moment, not really worrying about whether they get rejected or accepted because it's the practice that counts. And I think that this is a really good strategy to kind of get the rejection idea away from the idea of failure. And on this podcast, we've definitely talked about our fair share of failure. One of our most popular episodes, my interview with Leo Tawake, was all about failure and how to grow past it, right? But separating rejection from failure is really important because just because you're rejected does not mean that you made a mistake in any way. It's just that you weren't fit to someone else's criteria. And criteria can be anything. It doesn't have to be factual and it doesn't have to mean anything to you unless you decide it does. And in that case, that's a room for growth, right? We always said that failure and success kind of come hand in hand because you always figure out what to do next from failure and you're always winning a little from failure, right? So, now that we are finally ending this episode soon, I hope you've come to the conclusion that you are more than your rejections and that it is totally normal and totally okay if you feel really bummed about rejection because you are a teen and that is normal. Alright, as usual, I'm going to link this study in the description below so that you can check it out for yourself. But additionally, I just like to thank NIH and all of the researchers in this study for conducting this really important research and extending the scientific community's general knowledge about why teens feel things the way they do. That's all for me for now. Thank you for being in this space with us. This has been the TeenSpace Podcast, and you can find all of our socials along with the article in the description below. Bye-bye! Thank you for sharing this space with us.